the Southern Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, as well as the Indian Ocean. But he's got a fascinating story to tell, and I welcome Dr. Mike Coffin.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. I appreciate it. As was said, I'm going to talk to you about human exploration of the deep sea, and mainly deeper than a couple miles, as opposed to just diving off the shelf here. But first, I want to acknowledge the country. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Penobscot Nation of the Wabanaki Confederacy, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, waters, and culture of this area. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I see some young people in the audience, which is always great. And to that end, I just want to describe my career. It's not meant to brag about where I've been or what I've done, but just to show the opportunities you have with an advanced degree in sciences, as opposed to, say, law or medicine, where you've got to pass a state board or stay within your own country to practice your profession. With an advanced degree in science, or the humanities, or the social sciences, you can go anywhere in the world. And in an era of decreased globalization, that may not be so positive, but I've certainly enjoyed it in my career. So as was said, I crossed the border after high school to go to college, but during that time, I took 6 months off and I worked for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And one of those months was on land, actually doing technical work in their systems tech lab, and then the next 5 months were at sea on one of their research ships. I wouldn't recommend 5 months straight at sea to anyone unless you want to join the Navy, but it sealed the deal for me and convinced me that I wanted to go to graduate school and pursue a career in marine science. Went down to New York for graduate school, and then my first job was in the capital of Australia, the equivalent of the US Geological Survey, which is called Geoscience Australia, and I stayed there for 5 years. Then I went to the University of Texas at Austin for over 10 years, and from there I was recruited to go to the University of Tokyo, where I stayed for 7 years to help start up their co-leadership of scientific ocean drilling. And then got an offer to be Director of Research at the United Kingdom's National Oceanography Center in Southampton. And while I was there, a troop of Tasmanians came through and said, we're starting up a new institute in Australia that we want to model on the National Oceanography Center in the UK, which is a merger of university and a government lab. And so they said, do you want to be director? And I said, why not? Capped my career. So I moved to Tasmania in 2011. I've been headquartered there ever since. But in the meantime, I did a sabbatical at the University of Maine, so I also have a research professorship at the University of Maine at Orono, and I'm also an adjunct scientist at Woods Hole. So I've got these 3 positions that some people call a bipolar disorder, but it does involve some long commuting between Bangor and Hobart, which is 32 hours minimum and 4 flights. I'm a seagoing scientist. I spend a lot of time at sea. These are expeditions that I've been on. I've been chief scientist on, or co-chief scientist on 13 of them, and been on 24 others, most recently a couple of years ago. So that basically sums up who I am and where I've been. Doesn't say where I'm going, but who knows that amongst us. So today I want to talk about several topics. I'm going to talk about the development of submersibles that we dive into the ocean. I'm going to give an overview of research, human-occupied vehicles that can go deeper than a couple of miles. There are only a few countries that have this capability for academic work. Some of the same countries have it for military purposes, but they don't tend to reveal what they can do. Then I'll talk about a dive I did in Japan's submersible called Shinkai 6500. Then some high net worth individuals, we're talking many billions, have developed submersibles to pursue their dreams. And throughout, there's kind of an analogy with exploration of space, because until recently, more people had walked on the surface of the moon than had actually been to the deepest place in the ocean, but that changed a few years ago. So first, some terminology. HOVs are human-occupied vehicles, or submersibles, as I'll call them throughout this talk, ROVs are remotely operated vehicles. They're tethered with a long cable to a support vessel. And then there are robotic vehicles or autonomous undersea vehicles. And these are programmed, they use AI or machine learning to roam around the ocean and come back to a land or a mothership. So AUVs is another term I'll use. The history of submersibles goes back pretty far in time. So Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, as described by Aristotle a bit later, he was interested in diving. And back then, a diving bell, which I'll show a picture of next, was kind of how you did it, and you didn't go very deep. Then in the 1500s, an Italian inventor and his cohort dived on a Roman vessel in an Italian lake using a one-man or one-person diving bell. And in the 1600s and 1700s, they kept improving diving bell technology, and they used it mainly for salvage ships that had sunk. So this is a diving bell on the right. See how it got its name. On the left is artist's impression of Alexander the Great going beneath the sea, probably only a few tens of feet at most, in one of these bells. Submarines came along a little bit later, and this was an American invention. The first submarine, right at the time of the American Declaration of Independence, was the Turtle, and it attacked another ship. In 1800, Robert Fulton, famous name, designed and built the submarine Nautilus, and ever since then, there have been many, many submarines have been built, primarily for military purposes. But in terms of research, technology in the 1900s was mainly pursued by the United States. A guy named Otis Barton, an engineer, and a naturalist, William Beebe, developed a vehicle called a bathysphere. And between 1930 and 34, they tested this bathysphere off Bermuda, and they dove to over 3,000 feet in 1934, which was pretty remarkable for the time, although you couldn't convince me to get into this, to go down 3,000 feet. Another vehicle is called a bentoscope, developed about the same time by the same engineer. This was unpowered and it was lowered from a cable, and this went down 4,500 feet, and that's still a record. And again, you couldn't pay me enough to go down in this. But science was being pursued. They were observing what was living there. The next stage of development came in the late 1940s. Auguste Piccard in Switzerland developed a series of vehicles that culminated in Trieste. That was a self-propelled free diving. The first time there was something that could go along on its own power, dive and come back without being tethered to a ship. And they went down as deep as you can go, 6.8 miles in the Challenger Deep off the Mariana Trench. And there were two people aboard, Piccard and Don Walsh, who just passed away last year. The pressure down there is 1,000 times sea level pressure. So to build a vehicle to go to those pressures requires a lot of engineering and technology. Don Walsh was a new US Navy lieutenant, I think, at that stage. So this is a picture of the Trieste. This is where the two people were, and the rest of it is support system. And the support system for it is mainly gasoline tanks filled with gasoline, as shown in this diagram. These are gasoline tanks, these are gasoline tanks. They carry ballast, which carries them down, and then they release the ballast to come back up. There's some water ballast as well, but a lot of support just for this little place where the two people are. Observation gondola, it was called.
Hi, excuse me, are you taking questions or later?
Later, we'll go at the end, thanks. So who has, or which countries have deep diving research vessels or vehicles now? Well, France has one called the Nautil, which goes down to 6,000 meters. And I'll talk more about that later. The US has Alvin, operated by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. It started out much shallower up here, and it's been developed in stages. It was refit during COVID, and in 2022, it was certified to go 6,500 meters, or about 4 miles. Japan has had a vehicle that can go 4 miles for several decades now. And then China comes along and says, well, we want to go a little deeper than any of these guys, so we'll build a vehicle that can go 7,100 meters, and that's done many dives now. And then the Chinese took a big leap and said, we'll build a vehicle that can go to the greatest ocean depths, more than 10,000 meters, which they've done. And these are operated out of Qingdao, where China's marine science is headquartered. But then a high net worth individual, a billionaire, decided he wanted to dive to the greatest ocean depths, so he commissioned a Florida company to build a vehicle that could go to the greatest ocean depths as well. Its original name was Limiting Factor. Another billionaire has bought it off him, and it's called Bakunawa. So the timing of the development of these, Alvin was very much in the first, in 1964. There's a big 60th anniversary celebration this year. If you Google Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, there are all sorts of videos and celebrations of that 60th birthday. A couple decades later, along came MPhil in France, and a couple years later came Shinkai in Japan. Then a couple decades after that, Jialong came along in China, and then 10 years after that, a vehicle that could go to the greatest ocean depths. So we'll talk about Alvin first. I'll kind of go through these and give their specs and tell you what they've done scientifically and otherwise. So Alvin was designed by a guy named Harold Froelich. It was named for a scientist at Woods Hole, Alan Vine, so they just contracted his name into Alvin. It's the sphere that holds people, 3 people in this case, is built of titanium cast in 2 hemispheres and then bonded together. Entered service 40 years ago. The first version only went down 2,500 meters, then it was extended to 4,500 meters, and it did more than 5,000 dives with that capability. And then, as I said, just a couple of years ago, they increased the capability to 6,500 meters, which covers 95% of the ocean by volume. So despite not being 11,000 meters capable, it can cover the vast bulk of the ocean. So what has Alvin done? Well, it's helped find and recover parts from the 2 nuclear submarines, the Thresher and the Scorpion, that were lost in the 1960s. In 1966, there was a US bomber that crashed into the ocean off Spain, had a hydrogen bomb aboard. Fortunately, it wasn't that deep, just over 900 meters, and Alvin helped recover that. In 1967, Alvin was attacked by a swordfish at 600 meters depth. The sword got stuck into Alvin's skin, did an emergency surface. The fish was recovered at the surface, and everyone had sashimi. So in 1968, there was an accident. The cables broke during the launching. The crew escaped, and it was recovered a year later, but the crew hadn't managed to get their sandwiches. They weren't thinking about taking their lunch when the vehicle sank on them, but the sandwiches were still edible. So at those depths, 1,500 meters, everything perfectly preserved. So Alvin went to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in 1974 and confirmed that there was seafloor spreading. So we're spreading from Europe at about the rate your fingernail grows. In 1977, it went to the Galapagos Spreading Center in the Eastern Pacific. It found warm water coming out of the seafloor there. The ambient temperature of the water there is about 0 degrees, close to 0. Seawater freezes at about -4, so that's why water can be that cold and still be water. And then just a couple years later, it went back to the Eastern Pacific and found 380-degree water, centigrade water, coming out of these hydrothermal vents. These are called black smokers. And this opened up a whole new world of biological thinking. Chemosynthetic instead of photosynthetic organisms were found, and now many people think the origin of life comes from these chemosynthetic, or started with chemosynthetic organisms that don't need sunlight. They just need very hot water, and they're able to make life out of that. In 1986, the Titanic was the subject of everyone who knows who Bob Ballard is, probably. Famous explorer, probably the most famous marine explorer. And then in 2014, it went to the Gulf of Mexico to try and help stop the oil coming out of Deepwater Horizon disaster. And eventually they put a cap on that. And, well, Alvin didn't do that, but assisted by Alvin's observation, they did that. So what are a few specs of Alvin? Well, she's about 17 tons, 23 feet long, so not as long as an IOD out there at the fleet, 8 feet wide. The endurance is 72 hours, but usually it just does day dives. You start in the morning, come back at night, but to ensure a bit of redundancy in case something goes wrong, it can survive for 3 days on the seafloor without any problem. Maximum speed of 2 knots, so it's not going anywhere fast. The crew aboard is 1 pilot and 2 scientific observers, and you're in a sphere that's 6-foot diameter. Those 3 people for 10, 12 hours, so you get very comfy. Cross section, so this is where the people are here. This is all support system and propulsion and batteries. Manipulator arms in the front, camera systems, the way you get out through the hatch. And in the case of a dire emergency, this people part of the vehicle can actually separate from most of the rest of the vehicle, and this is buoyant, so it'll come up to the surface. And because the pressure inside the titanium sphere is at atmospheric pressure, you don't have to worry about the bends or anything. It can come up as fast as possible. So this is a picture of Alvin with its mothership, Atlantis, behind it. That big A-frame on the back of Atlantis is used to launch and recover the vehicle. If you're really interested in looking at pictures of the deep sea, this is a wonderful book that just came out a couple of years ago. It's by a bunch of Woods Hole scientists mainly. I know all these people: Carson, Kelly, and Fenari at Woods Hole, Perfits at Florida, and Shanks at Woods Hole. They're all, the top 4 are all geologists, so there's a lot of geology in this book. I don't know whether this library has the book or not, but I can recommend it. And Tim Shank is a biologist, so he studies life through the whole water column. We'll move on to the French submersible next, Nautil, which means Nautilus in French. Also a titanium sphere. It's run by a French institute that's unfortunately named Institute for the Exploitation of the Sea. They don't use that anymore. They just call themselves IFREMER for good reasons, but still the acronym stands for exploitation. It entered service in the late 1980s, and as I said, it can go to 6,000 meters. A couple of highlights there. It's been to the Titanic many times, and just a reminder, the Titanic sank in 1912, and the Air France flight that crashed off Brazil and was missing for, well, they didn't find it for more than a year. Nautil went and helped find it on the seafloor in pretty significant water depths. Its dimensions are very similar to Alvin, and this is a recurring theme you'll see in these research submarines. They're all about the same size. They're not that much different. It can go 1.5 knots instead of 2 knots for Alvin. It can stay on the bottom for nearly 5 days. So a lot of risk-averse safety built into the French vehicle. And again, 3 people in this 6-foot diameter sphere. Nautil here, you can see it looks a lot like Alvin. Whoops. And the business end here with all the cameras and manipulator arms and baskets for putting samples in, and the people are in this sphere here. Japanese submersible next, so Shinkai in Japanese means deep sea. The full name is Senkyu Namako, or sea pig, because the Japanese tend to name things like that. They call them like they see them, so the vehicle does look like a pig that's in the ocean. Same size sphere for the people, built to very high tolerance. There's less than 0.5 millimeter discrepancy across the whole sphere. It entered service in 1989, and its dimensions, again, are very similar to Alvin's. It's got life support for 5 days as well, so a lot of built-in redundancy. It can go a little faster than Alvin or Nautil. A lot of scientific equipment on board too. A cutaway of that, this is where the people are in here. Sample baskets, 2 manipulator arms. Back when I was on Shinkai, there was only one scientist aboard and a pilot and a co-pilot, but a couple of years ago, Japan decided that they could train a scientist to do emergency measures in case something happened to the pilot. So there's one pilot and two scientists aboard. And a typical dive off a mothership, descend at between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. Takes a long time to get down to the bottom. Obviously, the deeper it is, the longer it takes. On the dive I'm going to talk about, it took about 2.5 to 3 hours to get to the bottom, and you have all the lights off, so to save power, battery, it's all battery powered, so you're in the dark basically all the way down for a couple of hours. Get to the bottom, start working, work for as long as you have time for until the end of the day, until you have to surface, and then you blow the ballast and come back up, recovered by the support vessel. So I'm going to tell you about a dive I did more than 20 years ago. You might recognize me in some of the photos, but you might not. I'll give some geological background. I'll talk about the launch, the dive, the recovery, and what we do with the data. So this particular dive was off the west coast of the big island of Hawaii. This is Hawaii here, Kauai here, Oahu, Molokai, Maui, you all know the Hawaiian Islands, right? And these are all dive sites of a joint Japanese-American program. All these green dots show where dives have been done, mainly to sample the geology, so picking rocks off the seafloor with the manipulator arms. This particular dive was the 690th dive of this Shinkai 6500. It was on a feature that extends to the west from the big island called the Hualalai Ridge. And we were trying to see how related this ridge was to the big island here, Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea. First thing you have to do before you dive is collect bathymetry data. What does the shape of the seafloor look like? So the mothership has a great multi-beam mapping system that can map the seafloor in great detail. So we created this contour map before we dove to see where we wanted to go and how we might want to sample. And the dive in sort of latitude, longitude space was this. So we're going up the flank, go to the very bottom of the dive, and then you start working up the flank of this Hualalai Ridge. We finished at about 2,000 meters, started about 4,000 meters, and then we're surfaced and we're recovered. In depth, it looked like this. So dropped straight down to 4,000 meters for 2.5 miles, and then started working, very slowly working over about 5 hours, and then surfaced, which took about 2 hours. So this is the front end of Shinkai, where the action is. Big cameras, the portholes here, manipulator arms are out of sight down here, but here they are, that's one of them there. Sample baskets for whatever you want to be sampling, whether it's rocks, biology, etc. You put throw the sample in this basket. Sometimes you can cover them. If you collect something that's alive and you don't want it to get out, you snap a cover over the top of it. The entry and exit is pretty narrow. There's no fitness requirement, but some people just can't fit through this hatch, so makes them unable to dive. The chief scientist of this whole expedition, and in fact the Japanese co-chief scientist on all of those dives I just showed you, was a guy named Takahashi-san, or Takahashi-sensei from the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and that's Takahashi-san there. Now, the most common question I get is, you're down there for 10 or 12 hours, what if you gotta go? Well, this is the solution. A very well-illuminated Japanese plastic bag. Of course, you're with 2 other people in very close proximity. You're almost physically connected to them. So what happens is the day before, you basically don't eat anything, and you dehydrate. And then you take a lot of lifesavers with you to keep moisture in your mouth, and then when you get to the surface, everyone runs for the head really quickly. So that's the strategy. So now I'll go through the launch procedure of the vehicle. So this is the aft end of the mothership, the Yokosuka, and you can see Shinkai in here. And this big A-frame is going to lift Shinkai up, take it over the stern, and put it in the ocean. Just a sequence of photos here of that happening. That's about as high as you get in Shinkai, right at the peak of the A-frame's elevation from the deck view, and then start lowering it into the water. And there you can see the sample baskets, 2 manipulator arms there, porthole for the co-pilot in this case, the pilot, and then the other side, the scientist, and then all his camera systems. There's this tow line that's attached to the mothership, as well as these 2 big cables, so you've got to get rid of those 3 when you launch, and how that's done is with divers. So these snorkelers go into the water from this rubber ducky and go over to the vehicle and make sure everything's sealed. You don't want the hatch to spring a leak. And then they start disconnecting the vehicle from the cables. And with that accomplished, there's some little cables beneath these big cables. Those need to be disconnected as well. And then the divers say, time to leave the submersible behind. They go into the water. They detach the tow line and are towed back to the mothership with that. The rubber ducky comes in as well. Then Shinkai blows air out of its tanks and takes on water and starts to descend. On this particular dive, Kawama-san was my pilot, Nambu-san was my co-pilot, and we became very friendly over the course of 10 or 12 hours. I'd never met these guys before, but we got along well, thankfully. A very detailed logbook is kept, recording every observation. There are 2 scientists on the ship, and me in the vehicle is constantly communicating what I'm seeing. It's so expensive. I mean, the mothership is $100,000 a day. The vehicle is $50,000 a day. So a month at sea is like $4.5 million. So you want to maximize the scientific observations you take. And I asked, before I started diving, I asked an experienced professor of mine at Columbia, I said, how did you prepare? And he said, well, my wife takes me out driving on the New Jersey Turnpike, and I look at everything. I say, oh, there's a curb there, there's a garage there, there's a median strip there, and he describes everything. So he just talks nonstop for hours. Pity his poor wife. So what do we see on the seafloor? Well, these are submarine lavas that are now above sea level on a remote, desolate island in the Southern Ocean called Macquarie Island, where I've done field work and had students. That's me for scale. So these are tubes of lava that have flown basically downhill. And clearly geologists weren't involved in naming this feature. It's called Spaghetti Hill. It was named by biologists who didn't know what lava tubes look like. But anyway, it's always been known as Spaghetti Hill because it looks a lot like spaghetti. What do these look like underwater? Well, this is a broken off one here from my dive that I'm talking about. So you can see sort of the fresh core of the lava tube and then the outer surface, which froze basically when it touched seawater, but magma kept flowing through the insulated center of the lava tube. And I'm not going to talk a lot about geology, but I'll talk more about the life. So I saw, and the pilots saw, starfish living on these pillow or tube lavas, corals, beautiful things that you don't see near the sea surface in the photic zone. Does anyone know what percentage of the ocean's volume has no light whatsoever, no sunlight? Take a wild guess, anyone?
More than 90.
Yep, 95% of the ocean has no light, no photosynthesis, no anything. So all these life forms are surviving in the absence of photosynthesis. Some anemones and corals here living on the hard rock. More of them here, a veritable garden in the background there. And then here's a bunch of worms living on a coral. Looks like fishing worms. So we're at the end of the dive. We've come back up, and it's a little rougher. There's motion on the ocean. The divers come back up in the rubber ducky, towing the tow line. They throw the tow line over the side. They attach the tow line to the vehicle. The diver gets aboard. Some rock and roll. If you suffer from seasickness, it's not a good time. Uh, And then the A-frame has let the cables out, and the divers attach those to the vehicle, and then the big cables come down. They make sure those are secure. Once that happens, they get off the submersible, and the submersible is lifted out of the water with these sample baskets full, we hope. I collected 40-some, I filled 40 baskets with rocks on this particular dive. And then the vehicle's brought aboard, and there's the run to the facilities. So again, on a bathymetric map of where we went, various stops along the way where we spent a lot of time, these dense areas are where we collected a lot of samples going up the slope, and then this is where we started to surface. So very detailed records are kept. This is my dive summary for this dive. My name up here in katakana, Maiku Kofu Uen, Mike Coffin. And just a summary of the dive here, what we collected in terms of rocks and push cores. And then this is all published on a Japanese website in the English language. All the samples are described, so there are geologists on board the ship who saw the rocks in half, split them open, get a fresh surface. They draw pictures of it. Even now, they draw pictures, even with digital photography, they still draw pictures because you can highlight certain things in drawings that you can't highlight necessarily in a photograph. Summary of each sample, where it was collected, water depth, what it looks like, petrologic characteristics. And if you're ever really interested, you can go to this JAMSTEC website. Every dive that vehicle has ever done, you can look at every minute of video footage, every still picture that's been taken, every sample description that's been taken. So if you can't get to sleep at 11 o'clock at night, go to this website, and you could probably get in the mood for real slumber. And there are also highlights of each dive, so you go to their website and you say, I just want to see the highlights, and there are videos you can play of the highlights, the top 10 videos for that particular dive. Okay, next we'll move on to the Chinese vehicle, the Jiaolong Sea Dragon, and that's also got a titanium sphere. It's very much modeled on Alvin, No-Teal, Shinkai, the Chinese had dives in collaboration with researchers from France, the United States, and Japan, so they knew basically how they were designed and built. It entered service 14 years ago, goes 7,000 meters. Its specs are very similar to the previous ones I've talked about. It has an endurance of 72 hours, so 3 days redundancy. The pressure hull, very similar cross-section, business end back here and the work end up here, with cameras, sonar, sample baskets, manipulators. This is a picture of Jiaolong. Doesn't look much different than the others. Front end, very similar. Launched off a mothership with a big A-frame, so similar launch and recovery. Now, then the Chinese built one that could go to the greatest ocean depths. They call it Striver or Fenduje, and it also has a titanium sphere. And in 2020, it went to Challenger Deep, the deepest place in the ocean. This is the only picture I've seen of Fenduje, but again, looks like a sea pig. It's got manipulator arms, camera systems, baskets for storing stuff. Now we'll turn to what extremely wealthy people have done. So James Cameron built a vehicle in the late 2000s and early 2010s called Deep Sea Challenger. He actually contracted to be built in Australia. And his purpose was mainly to make money, to make National Geographic films or make a movie, and there is a movie about this. And then 6 years later, another billionaire, Victor Vescovo, came along and said, I'm going to contract a Florida company, Triton Submarines, to build a vehicle that can go to the greatest ocean depths. So that's what he did. He hired this to be built, and then he said, I need a mothership. So he's former US Naval Reserve, so he went to the US Navy. Do you have any ships to sell? So the US Navy sold him a surplus research vessel. And he promptly outfitted it with tens of millions of dollars of state-of-the-art marine mapping, submarine mapping systems, and chemical sensors, and he built landers to go down alongside his submersible. That vehicle has since been bought by another billionaire called Gabe Newell, who runs a gaming company called Valve, and his ocean exploration company is called Inkfish. He started his career with Microsoft. He was in charge of Microsoft's gaming division. Then he went off and started his own company, Valve. And then, of course, the unfortunate story of Titan and Stockton Rush in 2021. But first, we'll look at James Cameron. Similar in age to probably a few people in this room, obviously a famous film director, keen on diving to the Titanic and Bismarck. He did these in Russian submersibles that are now out of service. So when the Soviet Union fell, Russia closed down its research submersibles for academic or science purposes. And I think these two vehicles are mothballed now. I don't think they've been destroyed. And he went to Challenger Deep, and that's been portrayed in articles in National Geographic, and he made this movie called Deep Sea Challenge 3D, which you can watch. I don't know which streaming service has it, but it's probably National Geographic is the first choice. So it wasn't exact, there's no science at all involved in what he did. So you can say, well, mainly it's a revenue-generating project for him. It was a single-person vehicle, and it was built out of steel, the sphere, so it could go down very fast and come back very fast. This is what it looked like, very different than other vehicles. So the person's here, in this little sphere here, and he was kind of cramped up in that, because it was only 3 feet in diameter. And he's lucky he came back, because a bunch of systems failed on the Deep Sea Challenger. Hydraulic systems started to fail, and he was lucky to get back to the surface alive. And the reason I know that is a former master's student of mine at the University of Texas became his PR person on his mothership. And I was communicating with her during the whole preparation for the dive. And so I knew what was going on, and the general public didn't know what was going on. But everything I've heard is he's really lucky he escaped a fate on the seafloor with that vehicle. So it was basically useless when it came back. So many things had broken on it, and it was not deemed a reliable vessel, even though it passed various testing agencies. So he donated it to Woods Hole, a useless vehicle, let's give it to Woods Hole, a nonprofit. And that's a picture I took of it at Woods Hole in 2016. Looks pretty good. He just rented hired a commercial vessel to operate from. This is launching it. So Woods Hole really couldn't figure out what to do with it. What do you do with a useless submersible? So they said, well, we'll send it on a global museum tour. So the first museum that wanted it was Australia, because an Australian had designed the vehicle, and it was the National Maritime Museum in Sydney. And so they put it on a truck to truck it from Woods Hole down to New York to take flights to Australia. But on the Connecticut Turnpike, the bearings on the truck wheels heated up and burned, and half the vehicle burned up as well. So you can't say that this was a highly successful. But he survived, and he did get a movie out of it, so which you can look at. Next, perhaps a more interesting tale is Victor Vescovo, private equity guy, a true adventurer. His first major adventure was climbing the 7 highest peaks on the 7 continents. He said after that, what can I do next? Well, I think I'll ski the last 100 kilometers or 60 miles to the North Pole and to the South Pole. He did that. And then he said, what do I want to do next? And so he said, well, I think I want to dive to the deepest places in the 5 oceans. So the Arctic, the Southern Ocean, the Indian Pacific, and Atlantic. And so he, as I said before, he contracted this vehicle to go to the greatest ocean depths, to be built in Florida by Triton Submarines. There's a Discovery Channel movie about this called Five Deeps. There's also an excellent New York article published a few years ago called 36,000 Feet Under the Sea by Ben Taube. And I can recommend that to you. It's in 2020, it came out. But this, the New York article goes through the whole convoluted story of failure, success, failure in the sense of, well, we tried diving there, but it was too rough, or we didn't know where the deepest place was in the Arctic or in the Southern Ocean or in the Indian Ocean. So he first had to go survey the ocean, parts of the ocean where he thought the deepest places were. Does anyone know how much of the global ocean has been mapped in high resolution?
10%.
Oh, there's a minimalist. We're up to 26%, but that's mostly in the shallow ocean. So the deep ocean is less than 10%. So Victor is a fan of science fiction, and he named all his vehicles, mothership and landers after names in the Culture series of Ian Banks, a Scottish scientific fiction author. The motto of his expedition was, "In the deeps, knowledge." His vehicle is a two-person vehicle. It's only 4.5 feet in diameter, which is okay for two people. You'd like a bit more space, but it's very expensive to cast titanium at really high levels of accuracy or thickness. So he initially said that after this expedition going to the 5 deepest places, he was going to sell the whole system. And that was at the end of 2019, but then COVID came along, and he kind of got addicted to diving, and things changed. So this is a picture of the vehicle. Doesn't look like Woods Hole's vehicles. You can see, whoops, you can see propellers on. That's still working, yeah. You can see the propulsion on the side, portholes here, well, that's actually not a manipulator arm, that's more of a camera system. And this has been to the greatest ocean depths many, many times now, and many other places in the ocean as well. So it's a highly reliable, it went through full testing procedure as recommended by the Marine Technology Society. And if you want one, it's yours for $50 million. Triton Submarines will build you a new one for $50 million. Of course, then you have to get a mothership, and motherships aren't cheap. So you need a ship that's at least 200, 250 feet long. So, of course, if you buy a used US Navy vessel, you probably get one for a few tens of millions. And this is the used Navy ship, which is called Pressure Drop. He outfitted it, as I said, with the latest seafloor mapping system, which EM-124 is that system. He also put landers on it, these 3 landers, which are also named after science fiction names in the Ian Banks's books. They carried out additional scientific tasks. So these are independent vehicles that are dropped to the seafloor. They don't have any propulsion, and then they're told to rise back up, release their ballast, and rise up without any tethering. And each of these 3 landers was rated to 11,000 meters. I know one of them's been lost. I think maybe one of the other ones has been lost. So the guy who bought all this stuff from Victor Vescovo didn't get the full package. The scientific payload, so there's a video camera system, there's a biology box they put bait in the sample boxes and hope that things come in and snap shut. 2 of the landers had push cores, so it actually electric motors that pushed, if there was sediment on the seafloor, they'd actually push a core in and pull the core back out for sampling. And then Victor was very rigorous scientifically. So we can't see to the bottom of the ocean, so how do we measure the depth? Well, we use sound, but the velocity of sound in seawater changes according to temperature and salinity. So to get an accurate measure of the depth to the seafloor, you have to know what the salinity and what the temperature profiles are of the whole water column. So what did Victor do? Well, he bought systems to do that. So he was very rigorous scientifically and deployed these landers, got these profiles, calculated the depths of the seafloor at the greatest ocean depths to within probably 10 meters or a few tens of feet at best, That's as good as you can do. You can't do much better than that. And whenever he went to one of these 5 deep places, he would survey it and put these, they're called CTDs, which means conductivity, temperature, depth profilers. Conductivity is a proxy for salinity. How well seawater conducts electricity is a function of its salinity, so you can back calculate salinity from the conductivity measurement. So he did that. So he was very rigorous and to be admired for that. And he was also interested in science, so taking samples with these landers, biological samples, geological samples. And these are the landers here, 2 of them here, another one here. So they're not small things, and they're pretty complicated technologically too, even though they don't have propulsion. They've got systems on board, electrical motors to push cores into the seafloor and bait traps for living things. So as I said, he did this 5 deeps expedition in 2018, 2019, kind of circumnavigated the globe, started here in the Puerto Rico Trench, which is the deepest place in the Atlantic, went up to the Arctic, had to find the deepest place up there, which he did find. We knew the deepest place in the Southern Ocean, didn't know the deepest place in the Indian Ocean, so I had to go here first, where I've worked a lot, and then up here to this place. And in the New York article, they didn't have the permission of Indonesia to actually dive there or do any research there. So they were cowboys. They went there anyway, ignoring the Indonesian Navy. And then they went over to Challenger Deep, the deepest place in the ocean, and did multiple dives there, and then went down to Tonga Trench here, and then went back. So just a few statistics on those dives. Over 8,000 meters in the Puerto Rico Trench, over 7,000 meters in the Southern Ocean, Indian Ocean, these 2 places, within a couple hundred meters of each other. He went to this place first and found out this depth, then he went up here and found this depth, so that's where he dove. Then in the Pacific Ocean, along the Mariana Trench, where the Challenger Deep is, there's several deeps within that trench, places that are deeper than the average depth of the trench. And the deepest one is Challenger Deep, almost 11,000 meters, then only 100 meters difference, and then tens meters difference in these other deeps. And then he went down to the Tonga Trench, which I just show you that again. So the Tonga Trench is down here. This is where the largest volcanic eruption of the last 200 years happened 2 years ago, Hunga Tonga, that pumped tsunami and made a tsunami in Tonga, pumped all this water vapor into the atmosphere. Many scientists now believe is accounting for the hot weather of the last 2 years, the extremely warm weather, because water vapor is a much more efficient greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide or methane. So all that water vapor that volcano pumped in is maybe part of the cause of our extremely warm weather. And then he went up to the Arctic the last ocean is the Malloy Deep, which isn't that deep compared with all these others. So over the course of this expedition, he sailed 47,000 nautical miles in 10 months, mapped 300,000 kilometers square of seafloor. For reference, Maine is about 100,000 square kilometers, so 3 times the size of Maine he mapped, which in the global ocean isn't very much. 39 dives, put the landers down 50 times. No human had ever been to the bottom of those trenches, or the deeps in the Arctic, or to the Challenger Deep more than once, or to the summit of Mount Everest in the bottom. He likes these. No one else has done this. Small ego, right? But then he got addicted to diving, so he said, well, no one wants to buy this system off me very badly, so I'll keep it. And over in 2020, during COVID, he did an expedition basically circumnavigating the globe once again. He's a billionaire with a heart because this first dive was on a sunken French military submarine, sank with all hands, and he dove down to the wreck with the son of the captain of that submarine who was lost with all the other crew. So then he proceeded, some of my favorite places, Seychelles, Maldives, up into Guam, went back to Challenger Deep, and then continued back to the United States home base. So, as I said, 12 people walked on the surface of the moon. Happened a long time ago, in the space of a few years, and we haven't been back since. And up until 2020, fewer people had been to the deepest place in the ocean than had walked on the moon. But then Victor and his vehicle changed that picture. So as I said, Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard went there in 1960. Then James Cameron made almost a one-way trip there in 2012. And then Victor started taking people down, some of his billionaire mates, some of his adventure mates, some, an astronaut. He took Kathy Sullivan down there. He took first Asian person. He took Don Walsh's son while Don Walsh was still alive. So that was a really nice billionaire with a heart gesture. And sort of in late 2020, the Chinese vehicle went there as well. So that's added to the total of now 27 people have been to the bottom of the deepest place in the ocean. Richard Garriott, first person to both poles and to space and to Challenger Deep, first Jewish person, first Pacific Islander, first New Zealander, first Australian, and the first black person was my friend and colleague, Don Wright. So, he likes a lot of firsts. This, unfortunately, you may recognize this name, Hamish Harding. He fortunately went to the deepest place in the ocean, but then unfortunately he went with Stockton Rush down the Titan. So he survived the deepest place, but he didn't survive a much shallower place. So then he put it up for sale, the whole thing. And in this time, he sold the mothership, the submersible, and the landers for $50 million. So the whole package, $50 million. And the guy who bought it, I said, was Gabe Newell. You can Google Inkfish and find out about his marine research organization. And he's in partnership with the University of Western Australia and a foundation that was founded by Andrew Forrest, who owns Fortescue Mining in Australia. Forrest is his last name with two F's, so Australians being who we are, nicknamed him Twiggy Forrest. And then we're going to finish up with Stockton Rush. So again, almost 60 years old, he founded a company called OceanGate, and this was a purely commercial endeavor. He wanted to make a lot of money taking people down to the Titanic. And he had built a vehicle of his own design. He hired engineers on his own. Most of his engineers quit at some point along the way. And then there was the horrific accident just over a year ago when that vehicle imploded. And people ask me, well, what was the problem? Well, probably the design was the major problem. This doesn't look like any of the submersibles I've shown you. There's titanium caps on either end of it. And then there's this carbon fiber cylinder that connects the two caps. And the reason he built it this way is he wanted to fit as many people in and make as much money as possible from each dive. And as you've probably read, the control system was just a video game controller, so it wasn't sophisticated technology that was used. Although we did have life support, 5 people could stay alive for 4 days. And if you recall the accident, they kept looking, although the US Navy knew immediately. The US Navy has listening arrays all through the Atlantic Ocean, and they heard the implosion. So there's 99.999% probability. They can't reveal the locations of those for security reasons, but they knew that the vehicle was lost. But they kept, other Coast Guard and other entities kept looking for it until they finally found debris that had been destroyed. Again, this is the 2 end caps and the carbon fiber, and the Stockton Rush was up here, and his 4 passengers were sitting in the cylinder when it imploded. So way back in 2018, so 5 years before this accident, an international organization called Marine Technology Society recommended that his company institute a testing program to be reviewed by these 2 globally respected accredited classification societies, which is what all the academic research submersibles, plus Victor Vescovo's and James Cameron's vehicles went through. Stockton said, nope, I know better, and I don't need to do that. I trust my engineers and my technology, and we know the result. So a sad end to that particular commercial endeavor, and I don't know whether such tourism endeavors will be pursued anytime in the near future. He'll probably go down in history as being one of the few people who's killed 2 billionaires at once in that vehicle. Very sad. So that finishes my presentation. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Mike, I don't know where to start. Thank you very much. I do know where to start. So Susan Casey's book, The Underworld, it's a fantastic book, but she talks at the end about the mining of the ocean floor, and apparently the country of Norway has gotten permission to do that. Can you address that?
I'll start by saying I'm no expert on seabed mining, although National Geographic has quoted me as being an expert on seabed mining. I'm not. If you Google my name and National Geographic, you'll see quotes from me in there about seabed mining. Actually, it's a US and Canadian companies who are mainly pushing the technology to drive seabed mining. Last week, there was a fascinating election at the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica. That's the international body under the law of the sea that's charged with developing environmental protocols for mining the seafloor and implementing those protocols. They have not yet finished designing the protocols. And in my quotes to the media, I say, until we understand the ecosystems of the benthos, of the deep sea, how can we proceed without doing damage that we may realize 10, 20, 50 years from now? We need to understand the system before we start disrupting it in a big way. Last week's election, the head of the International Seabed Authority was running for a third term, which was highly unusual. He was British. Britain would only put him forward twice, so he had 2 4-year terms supported by Britain. He went to another country, I can't remember which, it's a tiny Pacific Island nation, and said, will you nominate me again, because I'm really in favor of getting revenue for that Pacific Island nation, from seabed mining. He's really pushing seabed mining in a big way. He was running against a Brazilian who's an environmental regulator, and she won the election overwhelmingly and amazingly to me, because Pacific Island nations are desperate. They know sea level's rising. They're going to have to move eventually off their islands, the low-lying islands anyway. And so they'd like to have the revenue despite the disruption of ecosystems. So yeah, it's a long and convoluted story, but stay tuned. See what the International Seabed Authority is up to in the next couple of years, because I think this Brazilian will take it in a different direction than Michael Lodge, the British guy who's been running it for the last 8 years. And it's important to note here, too, that the United States has never ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's a formal name. And that started during the Reagan years, because at that time, the administration and also the Senate did not want to give up the United States' unique ability to go and mine the deep sea floor wherever we wanted to. And various presidents have pushed it in a mild way to ratify the Law of the Sea, to get it through the Senate, but it's never happened. And I remember the last significant effort was under George W. Bush's regime. Condi Rice was really pushing to ratify the Law of the Sea, but it didn't happen. So we in the United States are kind of on the outside of the International Seabed Authority and all the other bodies associated with regulating the ocean. We follow the global example of 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, and we're collecting data to be able to extend that. For geological reasons, you can extend it beyond 200 nautical miles, but the US is just a bystander in all these meetings at the United Nations, which is really unfortunate from my perspective. We should be an active player, but we're just sitting on the sidelines. And the other countries I know, because I'm also an Australian citizen, and Australia is a signatory and has ratified UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. My Australian colleagues just tell me that everyone just kind of ignores the Americans because they say, well, you haven't ratified the treaty, the convention, so why should we listen to you? China, on the other hand, is very much, how shall I put it, in the South China Sea is very much in bully mode. Even though it signed and ratified the Law of the Sea, it does not adhere to the legislation of the Law of the Sea, especially in the South China Sea. You know, it says, our 9-dash line, that's ours. And I sit on a UNESCO committee that is charged with evaluating such claims. And the Philippines took China to the International Court of Justice in The Hague and won the case, saying all the countries around the South China Sea are entitled to their 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones. And China said, no, we're ignoring that. The whole thing's ours. So go away, countries. So anyway, I mean, even if we did sign it and ratify it, we've signed it, but we didn't ratify it. Who knows whether we'd obey it? Like China's setting a bad example of not obeying it, despite having gone through all the measures. Yes?
What are the minerals that are the subject of the seabed mining? Are they sitting on the surface or are they subsurface?
They're sitting on the seafloor. So the idea is just to get a big vacuum cleaner and suck them up to the surface, which creates huge plumes of sediment. And that water is so clear, the deep ocean, I mean, it's extraordinarily clear. So, you know, it's a big disruption. It would be a big disruption. Countries are entitled to mine within their exclusive economic zone, and one country, Papua New Guinea, is trying to do that, but they haven't succeeded in a big way yet. So the International Seabed Authority, just to clarify, it's only beyond national jurisdictions. So it's only what we call the high seas. So in the case of exclusive economic zones, it's beyond 200 nautical miles. If countries have made a case for extended continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, then the ISA can't, that's not in their bailiwick. So it's only the open ocean, basically. Yes?
So if you said you've mapped maybe 26% for 10% of the very deep ocean, so how do you know Challenger, I forgot what it's called, how do you know that's the deepest spot?
That's a very good question. We know the deepest spots are where one tectonic plate is going beneath another tectonic plate. We know where these trenches are. There have been enough spot crossings of those trenches to know where the deepest areas are, and then Victor goes and finds the absolute deepest spot in those. So, pretty sure those are the 5 deepest places in the 5 oceans. Dwayne?
Operational type question, really. What sea state or wave height could you guys actually launch this submarine in?
Wave heights up to about 10 feet.
10 feet? Really? That's surprising.
So they don't go very far north or very far south. They don't go into the roaring 40s, the furious 50s, or the screaming 60s very often. Although Victor went, you know, he went into the furious 50s in the Southern Ocean and the screaming 60s in the Arctic, so. Just have to wait for a weather window and do it very quickly.
Is Tasmania, is that a better place? You've been there for a long time, is it a better place? It's pretty far south also, Tasmania.
Hobart is about the same latitude as Portland, Maine, so 42 degrees south. So, yeah.
What are you doing next?
Well, 4 years ago, I had a program funded by Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States to investigate the boundary between the Great Pacific Plate and the Great Australian Plate, which also includes India. The boundary between those two plates is what we call a transform boundary, so the two plates are sliding past one another. and we put 27 seismometers on the seafloor around this boundary, south of New Zealand. We went back in 2021, and we only got 15 instruments back. So we've got 12 instruments still on the seafloor that I really want to recover, and they're worth about $2 million total. So the data on them are worth even more. So that's my next project, is to try and get those instruments back. But I still have 3 PhD students in Tasmania and research projects and research money there. So I keep going back there, but I'm also teaching for the University of Maine. There's one student here who did a capstone course at the University of Maine, where we take 8 rising seniors to Alaska, British Columbia, and Yukon every May to introduce them to, we call it sea to sky experience. So they experience Alaska along the coast, then we go up into the mountains, the North American Cordillera, then go up onto the glaciers. And that's to encourage the students to continue their studies beyond bachelor's degrees. And a donor gave us a lot of money to run this program for 10 years. And
one more question. I wonder if you ever recently ran into Vanessa O'Brien, who's an American woman who climbed K2, and she was trying to go to the deepest place in the ocean, and she apparently succeeded with the Explorers Club funding. Are you aware of her at all?
let's see, was her name on that list?
Also, I wonder if Sylvia Earle has been interested or helpful to you at all.
I know Sylvia Earle, I don't know Vanessa. Yeah, there's Vanessa there. She went down in 2020. The first dual UK-US citizen.
Good-looking women, that would be very nice.
Yeah, I don't know if Sylvia Earle would want to go down that deep. I'm sure if she were offered, she wouldn't say no, knowing Sylvia. Yeah.
Can you tell us some of the things that you saw that were pretty remarkable down there?
Well, I showed you pictures of the life, which to me was remarkable. The geology looks pretty mundane. All you see are these basalt. You see one type of rock, mainly in those pillow forms, those lava tube forms. So until you actually get those back to the lab and analyze their chemistry and look at them, we slice them into very, we call them thin sections. We look at them through a microscope. There's really not much startling to say. But the major result to come out of this work is we think that Hawaii has 2 zones of formation. There's a core zone that has one particular chemistry, and then there's an outer zone that has a different kind of chemistry. We don't really understand why that is, so we need more dives. Yeah. Yes?
Do you have any information about the dark oxygen study? I think.
Yeah, I know, I'm aware of that. So some scientists recently published a paper doing an experiment that was looking at the deep sea floor, and they put sort of canopy-like or enclosed systems around life forms down there, and also where there were no life forms, just around minerals. And they found where they put these just around minerals, there was oxygen being produced. And that sort of has shaken up the scientific community about, well, we don't need photosynthesis to produce oxygen. So we think that oxygen grew enough to support life as we know it about 2.3 billion years ago, something called the Great Oxygenation Event. Now we think that may be a series of steps instead of one big burst of oxygen coming into the system. So yeah, that's a really fascinating result that's just come out. Yeah. Congratulations for following that. Yeah.
Did you ever get a chance to meet John Costello and his family?
No.
I'm just asking because we're all over the state, and so it's, never know if you're in the middle.
I was at a meeting with his son in Singapore, the first World Ocean Summit. I think it was 2012 or 2011, but I didn't meet him. There were hundreds of people at that meeting, and I didn't meet him there.
Mike, could you tell me the name of the book that you talked about at the very beginning of the?
Yep, I'll show it. It's okay here. Discovering the Deep.
Thank you.
Yes?
Could you expand a little on the release of the salt water particles in the air and how that has raised temperature? I felt like you were saying that it might be raising global temperatures more than CO2.
So the Hunga eruption in 2022 is the largest volcanic eruption of the past 2 centuries since Krakatoa. And that eruption, apparently there was magma very close to the sea surface, and water somehow, a lot of water became suddenly available to access that red hot, 1100 degrees C or 1200 degrees centigrade magma. And that created this huge eruption that vaporized hundreds of thousands of tons of water that got pushed up into the stratosphere. And water vapor is among the most powerful greenhouse gases. Methane is like 20 times carbon dioxide's greenhouse gas equivalent. Water vapor is probably, don't quote me on this, but maybe 100 times. So if you put a lot of water vapor, that acts as an insulating layer, and the Earth warms up.
You need to get it in the stratosphere.
Yeah, you need to get it high, so it doesn't just fall out, precipitate. Sure.
What's it feel like to be in a submersible?
Usually at the end of this talk, I ask people, how many people in the room would like to go in a submersible? Raise your hand. Yeah, a few. It can be an extremely aesthetic experience. I found in this dive off Hawaii, turquoise seas and beautiful sky, and when you start the dive and you're looking out the porthole, there's light shades of blue, and as you go down slowly several hundred meters, you go through every shade of blue. Blue's my favorite color, until you can't tell the difference between the darkest blue and black. And that happened at around 800 meters, so 2,500 feet. The water's incredibly clear off there. And then coming back up, it's the same thing. You start saying, oh, is that blue I'm seeing, or is that still black? And then you come up and you see that whole gradation of blue. But other than that, it's extremely, I feel extremely privileged to have been to the bottom of the ocean. I'd been studying the bottom of the ocean for 20 years before I actually got down to actually see it. I use remote sensing mainly, like with these seismometers south of New Zealand. So just getting there and seeing it firsthand for me was a huge, huge benefit.
Does the atmosphere change in the vessel going down, so you have to go slowly? Is there a pace going up?
No.
Constant?
It's normal atmospheric pressure inside the titanium sphere. And that's why the titanium sphere is this thick and the portholes are this thick.
So nothing goes in or out of it, it's just
No.
totally.
You're a self-enclosed system, yeah. Yep.
You mentioned in an early slide that there were some parallels between space travel and other than the obvious with life support systems. You have some other parallels with each area.
Well, the ocean is the problem because there's too much pressure, and space because there's no pressure. So that's the big contrast. You've got to design things for those two very different environments. It requires a lot of different engineering, but you may know that many oceanographic institutions have been contracted now by NASA to try and develop sampling methods for oceans on Jupiter's satellites and perhaps other planets. So it's a really interesting time to be in oceanography because NASA and other space agencies around the world are thinking, man, we've got to go study these oceans on other planetary bodies, and these are the guys who know how to do it, the guys who work at the oceanographic institutions. So it's pretty fun, yeah. Well, thanks very much. You've been a great audience.